Hello everybody, I'm David Shuster and thanks for joining us. I'm going to break from our usual video format for this one because so many of us are now thinking about the life of President Jimmy Carter. Amidst all the tributes to his decency, successful post-presidency, and tireless promotion of peace around the globe, I want to share a fun personal story about him. It involves this.
Welcome back to Hardball. We're back with the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. His new book is called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. And President Carter, why did you use the word apartheid in the book's title?
Well, let's look at the entire title, if you don't mind. The first word is Palestine.
That was Jimmy Carter on MSNBC in 2007 talking about a controversial book he had just written. A much younger than now David Shuster was a correspondent and anchor at the time for MSNBC and NBC News. And on that fateful day in 2007, when Chris Matthews called out sick a few hours before President Carter was due in our Hardball DC studios for a live interview, it fell to me to crash read President Carter's controversial book and do a lengthy live interview with him. I'm going to play part of that interview in a moment because Carter's vision and wisdom are timeless, as you will see. But first, the personal story. I had spent a lot of time in the Middle East, including living in Israel for a year when I was 18. So I was confident in the material and issues President Carter and I would be delving into and debating, despite the nervousness of having a former president sitting across the desk from me with his Secret Service detail just out of camera view, including one agent who was guarding the studio door. That part was unique and a bit intimidating. Nonetheless, once the interview started, my adversarial questions and follow-ups seemed to flow naturally, as did the president's calm yet firm defense of his provocative book. It was a terrific interview, and it made some news when President Carter confirmed publicly for the first time that he believed Don Rumsfeld, President George W. Bush's former Secretary of Defense, was the worst ever. But what really sticks in my memory is the small talk before President Carter and I started the interview. We had to sit at the Hardball desk on the studio set for about 10 minutes while the tech crew adjusted lights, camera angles, microphones, and etc. It was just President Carter, Nobel Prize winner, and this young anchor correspondent trying to make pleasant chit-chat with him. President Carter did not know me, and I'm sure he was disappointed that Chris Matthews, his former speechwriter, was not there to talk about the book and catch up. Nonetheless, President Carter could not have been more warm, gracious, and engaging. I had read somewhere that he swam nearly every day to try and stay in shape, something that my own father did into his 80s. So I asked the president about his swimming. President Carter confided that he only stayed in hotels that have large enough swimming pools to do laps. We then chatted about swimming and our family exercise routines, again as the Hardball crew was still tinkering with the lights. We still had a few more minutes, so I then asked about the White House swimming pool. From the pictures I had seen and remembered, the pool was likely too small in the 1970s when Mr. Carter was president to do anything but splash around. Still, asking a former president about the personal or family life they had at the White House could have been construed as a bit much on my part, so I asked about the pool with a chuckle, hoping that would make my question a little more comfortable. Sure enough, President Carter paused, broke into a sheepish smile, and said, "I'll tell you, the one thing I didn't like about the White House was the pool. It was tiny." We both laughed and began the interview on camera a minute later. Afterwards, the president stuck around to say hello to all the crew and staff on the Hardball DC team. To this day, whenever I swim laps, I think both of my dad and former President Jimmy Carter. Hopefully the pool in the great beyond is more than adequate. Now, here's a chunk of the on-camera interview we rolled.
The connection of those isolated but multiple settlements, more than 200 of them, with each other by highways, on which Palestinians can't travel, and quite often where Palestinians cannot even cross. So the persecution of the Palestinians now under the occupying territories, under the occupation forces, is one of the worst examples of human rights deprivation that I know. And I think
even worse, though, than a place like Rwanda?
Yes, I think, yes. You mean now?
Yes.
Yeah,
I think the impression now of the Israelis, of the Palestinians by the Israelis, is worse than a situation in Africa like the oppression of Rwandans and the Civil War.
I'm not going back into ancient history about Rwanda, but right now, the persecution of the Palestinians is one of the worst examples of human rights abuse I know, because the Palestinians...
When you're talking about right now, you're not talking about, say,
I'm not talking about ancient history, no.
Well, Rwanda wasn't ancient history, it was just a few years ago.
You could talk about Rwanda if you want to. I want to talk about Palestine. What is being done to the Palestinians now is horrendous. In their own territory, by the occupying powers, which is Israel. They've taken away all the basic human rights of the Palestinians, as was done in South Africa against the blacks. And I make it very plain in this book that the apartheid is not based on racism, as it was in South Africa, but it's based on the desire of a minority of Israelis to acquire land that belongs to the Palestinians and to retain that land, and then to exclude the Palestinians from their own property and subjugate them so that they can't arouse and demonstrate their disapproval of being robbed of their own property. That's what's happening in the West Bank. And the people in this country, in America, never know about this. They never discuss this. There's no debate about it. There's no criticism of Israel in this country. And in Israel, there is an intense debate about the issues in this book. In this country, no.
I agree. I mean, I wish we had that sort of debate that they're having in Israel. I wish we had that in the United States. But give us a sort of sense, how much of the responsibility for the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, do you think belongs to the Israelis for their tactics like seizing land and occupying territory that didn't belong to them? How much of it is the responsibility of the Palestinians for their suicide terror attacks and their bombings within Israel proper?
Well, as a matter of fact, the basic cause of the conflict is a sustained occupation of other people's land by the Israelis. And this is a direct violation of United Nations resolutions. It's a direct violation of the International Quartet's roadmap. It's a direct violation of the commitments that leaders of Israel have made in the past at Camp David when I was president and in Oslo, promising that Israel would withdraw from occupied territories. They have failed to do so. In response to that, and I'm not excusing them, there have been acts of violence. As a matter of fact, though, Hamas, the number one accused persons of violence, have not committed an act of suicide bombing that caused an Israeli life now since August of 2004.
Now, obviously, things have changed. Hamas carried out the October 7th attack last year in Israel proper, massacring over 1,000 innocent Israeli civilians. And in response, Israel launched the war on Gaza to try and eliminate Hamas once and for all. But back to President Carter. Much of what he was saying 17 years ago was extremely controversial. And there were, as I tried to point out at the time, legitimate criticisms of Carter's book. He used the word apartheid, but acknowledged he was only referring to the disputed West Bank, not to all of Israel. And perhaps President Carter could have been savvier in making the distinction before going into the political minefield in his book and in interviews. Nonetheless, the criticism of Jimmy Carter at the time was over the top. Democrats, of course, in addition to Republicans, claimed he was being anti-Semitic and treated President Carter dismissively and with disdain. But the facts are, what Carter was saying in 2007, they were accurate. And most Israelis, according to polls, acknowledge that Palestinians in the disputed territories, including the West Bank, are treated as second-class citizens. There are 2 million Palestinians in Israel proper who have full rights, but in the disputed territories, the West Bank and Gaza, apartheid is appropriate. And 17 years ago, Jimmy Carter showed a very unusual form of political courage. There was no former president, maybe no other politician, who showed as much courage as Jimmy Carter, not just on the Israeli-Palestinian debate, but on human rights in general. Historians will long debate Carter's time in office from 1977 to 1981. When he entered the White House, inflation and unemployment were high. Carter had to steer America through an energy crisis. There was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then the agonizing and long-lasting Iran hostage crisis. Carter will always be remembered, of course, for the infamous Malaise speech in January 1979 when he addressed what he called a crisis of confidence among the American people. His address was so pessimistic that it permanently damaged his political standing. And Mr. Carter learned the hard way that while it may be good leadership to tell the American people certain truths they don't want to hear, it is not good politics. Still, following his landslide loss in 1980 to Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter kept serving the greater good. He traveled the world, monitored elections, created nonprofits, built homes in America with Habitat for Humanity, and was unafraid to speak his mind publicly and in books. He wrote 40 of them, making Carter the most prolific book writer of any U.S. president in history. But most importantly, no president has ever been as decent, honest, and most passionately dedicated to peace and justice as Jimmy Carter. His integrity and independence often made waves. But if there was ever a president, an ex-president, who nobody owned but the American people, it was the former nuclear scientist, peanut farmer, and yes, swimmer from Plains, Georgia. A consistent theme from all of us in media, politics, and beyond who had the honor of talking with Jimmy Carter is this. President Jimmy Carter was one of the kindest and most thoughtful people any of us have ever met. I'm David Shuster. Thanks for joining us.